Hello, my name is Bill Coughlin, and welcome to First Person Civil War Podcast, which retells the stories of the soldiers and officers on the ground in the battles of the Civil War. As this episode coincides with the 161st anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, I have decided to make it a special episode, which incorporates 3 points of view. Episode 27 is entitled 3rd Lieutenant Rogers and the 47th North Carolina face Corporal Strong and the 121st Pennsylvania on 1 July, and 1st Lieutenant Seville and the 1st Delaware on 3 July at the Battle of Gettysburg. For reference, I recommend American Battlefield Trust's maps for the 1 July fighting on McPherson's Ridge and the 3 maps of Pickett's charge. The first source for this special episode is 3rd Lieutenant J. Rowan Rogers with his account of the Battle of Gettysburg, entitled Additional Sketch 47th Regiment, featured in histories of the several regiments and battalions from North Carolina in the Great War, 1861 to 1865, written by members of the respective commands, Volume 3. William W. Strong's History of the 121st Regiment Pennsylvania Volunteers by the Survivors Association, an account from the ranks, provides the Union source for 1 July, as they faced the 47th North Carolina on McPherson's Ridge. For the fighting at the Stone Wall on Cemetery Ridge on 3 July, William P. Seville's book, History of the 1st Regiment Delaware Volunteers, from the commencement of the 3-month service to the final muster out at the close of the rebellion, provides the Union perspective as the 47th North Carolina advanced upon their position during Pickett's charge. J. Rowan Rogers lived in Wake County, North Carolina, before the war began, and enlisted in Company I of the 47th North Carolina on 8 May 1862. The regiment, from January to March, recruited from Wake and the surrounding counties, and after filling its ranks, was assigned to the Department of North Carolina. J. Rowan Rogers joined the regiment as a 3rd lieutenant, traditionally the lowest-ranking officer in a company, and they stayed in the state without seeing any action until May 1863, when they were sent to Virginia after the Battle of Chancellorsville. 3rd Lieutenant Rogers and the 47th North Carolina were assigned to Brigadier General James J. Pettigrew's brigade in Major General Henry Heath's division of Lieutenant General A. P. Hill's corps in the Army of Northern Virginia, commanded by General Robert E. Lee. William W. Strong lived in Philadelphia when on 19 August 1862 he enlisted as a corporal in Company E of the 121st Pennsylvania. The men mostly came from Philadelphia, as all but 2 companies raised men from that city. The 121st Pennsylvania saw service at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, and as they marched north into their home state, they were assigned to Colonel Chapman Biddle's 1st Brigade, of Major General Abner Doubleday's 3rd Division, of Major General John F. Reynolds's 1st Corps, in the Army of the Potomac, commanded by Major General George G. Meade. William P. Seville lived in Wilmington, Delaware at the beginning of the war, and initially served in the 90-day 1st Delaware Infantry as the regimental adjutant with the rank of 1st Lieutenant, and held the same rank and position in the 3-year regiment of the same name. The 1st Delaware fought at Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville, and by the Gettysburg campaign, they were assigned to Colonel Thomas A. Smith's 2nd Brigade, in Brigadier General Alexander Hayes's 3rd Division, of Major General Winfield S. Scott's 2nd Corps, in Major General Meade's Army of the Potomac. The Army of Northern Virginia began the march north in early June, and had by late that month occupied areas north and west of a town called Gettysburg, which was a junction of several roads in the region. On 30 June, Major General Heath ordered Pettigrew's brigade to march into the town of Gettysburg to search the town for army supplies, shoes especially, and return the same day. As Pettigrew began his march toward the town, Brigadier General Buford and his cavalry division entered Gettysburg at about 11 a.m. from the south. Alerted by the townspeople, he moved his force to the western side and halted Pettigrew's advance about 1/2 mile outside of the town, after a brief exchange of gunfire. 3rd Lieutenant Rogers started his narrative after the brigade marched back from Gettysburg on the night of 30 June. They were assigned to picket duty for their brigade along the Chambersburg Pike. While 3rd Lieutenant Rogers stood picket, Lieutenant General A.P. Hill, having only partial knowledge of what force occupied the town, ordered Major General Heath to advance again toward Gettysburg the next morning to discover what was in my front. For the rest of the day, Brigadier General Buford sent reconnaissance parties and gathered that Major General Heath's division faced him along the Chambersburg Pike. He arrayed cavalry along the pike and sent a letter which described the situation at Gettysburg at 10:40 p.m. to Major General Reynolds and his 1st Corps, who were the closest infantry force to him. Corporal Strong and the 121st Pennsylvania had just crossed into their home state on the 30th, and by that night were 6 miles south of Gettysburg, with the regiment placed on picket duty for the night. The next day, Corporal Strong noticed that the movement of the 1st Corps had now taken on a new sense of urgency. The column was set in motion while the regiment was yet on picket, but orders were hurriedly given to withdraw and fall in, and with 2 companies deployed as flankers. They marched along the Emmitsburg Road, and he continues. And passing the brow of a hill, on a pretty broad road leading into Gettysburg, when it became evident that a conflict was near at hand. On the morning of Wednesday, 1 July, 1863, Major General Heath sent 2 of his brigades down the Chambersburg Turnpike, right into Brigadier General Buford's 2 cavalry brigades. The Battle of Gettysburg had begun. Pettigrew's brigade remained in their position until about 2 p.m. By this time, elements of the 1st Corps had replaced Brigadier General Buford in line, and he in turn sent a brigade south. As 3rd Lieutenant Rogers and the 47th North Carolina marched into their first battle, they were eager for a fight. The 47th Regiment was fired into from both sides of the road, and a halt was immediately called. When the enemy was discovered to be advancing from both our right and left flank. This was dismounted cavalry from woods along Willoughby Run, and he continues, notwithstanding, this was a great surprise to all of our regiment, for we were all anxious for the fray. After engaging the Confederates for an undisclosed amount of time, the Union cavalry departed, but they had served their purpose on the field, delaying the Confederate advance. 3rd Lieutenant Rogers and the 47th North Carolina crossed Willoughby's Run and continued advancing toward a ridgeline. Corporal Strong and the 121st Pennsylvania had marched through the town of Gettysburg and established a line of battle on McPherson's Ridge by 11 a.m. As his regiment now formed the extreme left of the army on 1 July, Corporal Strong also noted the strength of the enemy as they laid down in their position. This position was subjected to a concentrated fire from a line of rebel infantry that far overlapped the Union line. No infantry support whatever was on the left of the regiment, and no obstacle in the way of the passage of any portion of the enemy to its left and rear. The force that marched toward Corporal Strong was the 47th North Carolina, directly in front of them, and the 52nd North Carolina, which overlapped their flank. The Pennsylvanians waited patiently for what was to come. As soon as the Confederates had reached within a few yards of the top of the ridge, the men arose and delivered their fire directly into their faces, staggering them and bringing them to a stand. And from that moment, the musketry rattle and artillery fire kept up such a constant roar as would bewilder men under any other circumstances. The first volley from Corporal Strong and the entire 1st Brigade was devastating to Pettigrew's men, but 3rd Lieutenant Rogers and the 47th North Carolina continued advancing toward the 121st Pennsylvania. We crossed a stream, meaning Willoughby's Run, and then up a hill through a wheat field, and then in our front, not over 75 yards off, we see the heavy lines of Yankees with their guns shining and flags waving. The struggle grows hotter and hotter. Men are falling in every direction, but the 47th and 52nd are pushing the enemy steadily back and are going forward. At some point, Confederate artillery began targeting the 1st Brigade on McPherson's Ridge, and Colonel Chapman Biddle, commander of the 1st Brigade and the 121st Pennsylvania, had to use the ridge to his advantage. The position of the brigade was varied 2 or 3 times in order to shelter the men from heavy artillery fire that enfiladed them from the north. This meant shooting down the line lengthwise. 3rd Lieutenant Rogers, after witnessing one such retreat down the ridge line by the 121st Pennsylvania, was surprised to see them return. Men had fallen wounded and killed, like hail from a heavy hailstorm. The attention of the 47th was diverted from the enemy on our immediate front, and almost before we knew it, the enemy had rallied and was attempting to charge our lines. Besides, they had a number of pieces of artillery helping them, wherever the opposing lines were far enough apart for them to use artillery without striking their own men. Though it may have looked like the 121st Pennsylvania was preparing for a charge, they had no capacity to do this, as the 52nd North Carolina outflanked them. A possible explanation was the shifting of troops to better engage the flanking North Carolinians. Despite fighting on front and flank, Corporal Strong stayed in line with the 121st Pennsylvania until 4 p.m. The ground was thus held against vastly superior numbers for considerable time, during which the losses inflicted on the enemy were greater in actual numbers than our own. As the contest continued, however, the enemy could be plainly seen developing their lines further to the south, and as there was no troops to receive them, it became painfully evident that the line would be forced to fall back. By the late afternoon, the entire Union line north and west of Gettysburg became untenable, as the Army of Northern Virginia outnumbered the 1st and 11th Corps on the field. Both corps retreated through the town and reformed on the hills and ridges south of Gettysburg, alongside other Union corps that had arrived during the fighting. Not only did these commands suffer heavy casualties in killed and wounded, but also in captured. The 121st Pennsylvania, for example, lost 12 killed, 107 wounded, and 61 captured. The regiment was held in reserve on 2 July and moved to the Hummelbaugh Farm in the late morning of 3 July. There, they witnessed Pickett's charge, but were again held in reserve. The fighting on 1 July proved the only combat of Corporal Strong and the 121st Pennsylvania at the Battle of Gettysburg. Pettigrew's brigade suffered severely on 1 July. Major J. Jones, commanding the brigade by the end of the battle, estimated the 26th North Carolina, a regiment in the brigade, had lost half of their fighting strength meeting the Iron Brigade in the Woodline and then fighting on McPherson's Ridge. The 47th North Carolina sent a few companies to assist the brigade's left flank, but most of their casualties came from the fighting on the ridge. The 47th North Carolina did not participate in the fighting on 2 July. Instead, 3rd Lieutenant Rogers and his brigade spent the day resting and redrawing ammunition. 1st Lieutenant Seville and the 1st Delaware were encamped in Uniontown, Maryland, on the morning of 1 July, approximately 20 miles south of Gettysburg, and began the march north early. News had already reached the men by noon that Major General Reynolds, the 1st Corps commander, was killed on the west side of town, and that the Union line was being hard-pressed. By that night, the regiment was about 2 miles south of the town, within the Army of the Potomac's lines. The 2nd Corps arrayed along Cemetery Ridge, which was now the center of the Army of the Potomac. 1st Lieutenant Seville and the 1st Delaware served on the skirmish line throughout 2 July and participated in the back-and-forth struggle for the Bliss Farm, beyond the Emmitsburg Road, but were unable to gain control of the farm on 2 July. As the fight for the farm raged, Captain James P. Postles of Company A volunteered to deliver orders back to Cemetery Ridge and returned unharmed. Late in the morning of 3 July, the 14th Connecticut, a regiment from their brigade, occupied and burned it. Though the fighting in the center on 2 July was significant, the main Confederate efforts were on the flanks of the Army of the Potomac. General Lee sent Lieutenant General Richard S. Ewell's 2nd Corps to assault the Union right, while Lieutenant General Longstreet and his 1st Corps assaulted the left, in places such as Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, Devil's Den, the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, and Little Round Top. The fighting was intense. Though Longstreet's men were able to rout the Union 3rd Corps at the Peach Orchard, the 5th Corps, elements of the 2nd Corps, and several other formations managed to hold the line at great cost. On the morning of 3 July, fighting at Culp's Hill continued, but the deciding point of the engagement came with the Confederate assault upon Cemetery Ridge. General Lee gave Lieutenant General Longstreet Major General Pickett's division from his own corps, Heath's division, now commanded by Brigadier General Pettigrew, and Pender's division, commanded by Major General Isaac R. Trimble, both from A.P. Hill's corps, to make the assault that targeted Cemetery Ridge, held by the 2nd Corps. Keep in mind that in both sources, the estimations of time and distance vary. 3rd Lieutenant Rogers and the 47th North Carolina, ready to re-enter the fight, marched to Seminary Ridge, where the Confederate assault formed. Early on 3 July, the 47th, with the balance of Pettigrew's brigade, was ordered considerably to the right of where it had fought on 1 July. It reached its position about 9 o'clock and remained quietly in line just rear of a Confederate battery. In the early afternoon on 3 July, the largest artillery barrage of the war commenced, focused on Cemetery Ridge. 1st Lieutenant Seville and the 1st Delaware were now behind the stone wall and along an apple orchard. On the morning of 3 July, a dropping fire of skirmishers began at daylight and continued, with an occasional shot from a battery, until 10 o'clock, when all firing ceased, and an ominous quiet fell upon both armies. This silence was suddenly broken at 1:30 o'clock by the report of a gun from the neighborhood of the seminary building, followed immediately by a simultaneous discharge from many batteries planted north, east, and west of our position. The enemy kept up an incessant fire of shot and shell on the center, held by the 2nd Corps. Though the Confederate intent was to destroy artillery on the ridge, their fire was not effective in that regard. The 2nd Corps did suffer casualties during the bombardment, such as Colonel Thomas A. Smith, commander of the 1st Delaware, and that brigade. But Union artillery eventually began counter-battery fire. When the bombardment lifted, approximately 12,500 men, including 3rd Lieutenant Rogers and the 47th North Carolina, began their advance toward Cemetery Ridge. About 3 o'clock, a slight cessation in the firing of artillery occurred, and then the voice of our colonel, George H. Faribault, was heard loud and clear. "Attention, battalion!" And this was repeated by the brave and beloved Lieutenant Colonel John A. Graves. Every man sprang into line and was ready to go forward. The men knew not where, for the ridge just in front of the 47th Regiment obstructed the view of the regiment beyond 25 yards. The order was soon given to move forward, which was done in good order and without any confusion. Brigadier General Pettigrew's division was the front rank of the Confederate left, with Major General Trimble's division in the second supporting line. Major General Pickett and his division dressed on their right, and all 3 divisions continued their advance. 3rd Lieutenant Rogers and the 47th North Carolina marched into the field in full view of the Union Army. No one hesitated, no one faltered, but a good, steady quick step was kept up. After leaving our batteries about 50 or 100 yards, the enemy commenced a terrific cannonade and kept it up until we were so close that they could not use the cannon. As our regiment advanced, great gaps would be knocked into our lines by the Yankee artillerymen at almost every 5 or 10 steps, but they were immediately filled in by our brave boys, closing in and filling up the gaps. 1st Lieutenant Seville and the 1st Delaware, having survived the artillery bombardment, awaited the Confederate advance. The firing of the batteries ceased, and the enemy's infantry marched across the plain and charged our line. We were cautioned to hold our fire until the rebels began to climb the fence along the Emmitsburg Road. When this obstacle was reached, the ranks were thrown into some confusion, when at the word, "Fire!" such an appalling sheet of flame burst from our line that the rebel ranks melted away like wax, and none of them reached a point in our front nearer than 50 yards. The dreadful execution in our front was owing to the fact that the men of the 1st Delaware, 14th Connecticut, and 12th New Jersey had collected all spare guns, had prepared a large supply of cartridges, and laid them in rows beside them, and the men in the rear rank loaded the muskets as fast as those in the front could fire them. All along the Confederate line, they suffered heavy casualties, but still, the regiments moved forward, 3rd Lieutenant Rogers and the 47th North Carolina included. About 150 yards from the rock wall, while crossing one of the many fences which ran across the ground we were charging over, I was shot in my left leg and thrown from the fence. When I arose, the remnant of our fine regiment was reduced to a mere handful of brave men, still going forward from 30 to as close as 10 steps to the rock wall. Seeing this, and having recovered from my fall and my leg not seeming to be badly hurt, I made a rush to join the set of brave men nearest the enemy, when I was startled to hear the command given the Yankee skirmishers. "To the front!" Lieutenant Colonel Graves gave the order for the handful of brave men to lie down, hoping thus to hold his position until reinforcements should come up. But none came. Though 3rd Lieutenant Rogers described them as skirmishers, what advanced upon the 47th North Carolina was 1st Lieutenant Seville and the 1st Delaware, which included Private Bernard McCarran and Private John B. Marbury. When the rebel charge was broken and their ranks fell into disorder, the 1st Delaware sprang over the stone wall en masse and charged with the bayonet upon the rebel fugitives. A hand-to-hand conflict ensued, in which numberless instances of gallantry occurred, and hundreds of prisoners were sent to the rear. As the men of the 1st Delaware leapt from their position, they captured the remnant of the 47th North Carolina in front of the wall, as well as 5 battle flags. Private McCarran wrested the 13th Alabama's flag from its color bearer, while Private Marbury did the same with the 7th North Carolina's battle flag, which was the regiment directly behind the 47th North Carolina in line. 3rd Lieutenant Rogers managed to evade capture, given the length of separation between him and the regiment after he was shot in the leg. The largest number of those who got out of that charge were those who had been slightly wounded before they got too close to the breastworks to fall back, and those who were wounded early enough in the charge to be carried back by our own men. He notes that Lieutenant Colonel Graves and a few more officers were also captured, and then finishes his report. As I have stated above, there was no faltering on the part of the 47th on 3 July 1863. All did their duty and acted the part of brave soldiers. With the failure of Pickett's charge, the Battle of Gettysburg was over. Both armies remained in position the next day, 4 July. But General Lee began his retreat back to Virginia by that evening. The Battle of Gettysburg, from 1 to 3 July, was a Union victory, but it was also the bloodiest engagement of the Civil War, with combined casualties at approximately 50,000 men. 3 soldiers from the 1st Delaware received the Medal of Honor for their actions at the Battle of Gettysburg. For his actions on 2 July, Captain Postal's citation reads, "Voluntarily delivered an order in the face of heavy fire from the enemy." 2 of the 5 flags that the 1st Delaware captured were taken from Confederate color bearers, the 7th North Carolina by Private Marbury and the 13th Alabama by Private McCarran, rather than picking them up from the ground. They received medals of honor for this action. Both of their citations read, "Capture of Flag." Following the war, some states had programs to record regimental histories. J. Rowan Rogers provided Additional Sketch 47th Regiment as part of the multi-volume Histories of the Several Regiments and Battalions from North Carolina in the Great War 1861 to 1865, written by members of the respective commands, which was funded by the state of North Carolina around the turn of the century. The Historical Society of Delaware approached the 1st Delaware Regiment Association with the request to write a history of the regiment, and William P. Seville obliged with his 1884 book, History of the 1st Regiment Delaware Volunteers, from the commencement of the 3-month service to the final muster out at the close of the rebellion. Though the state of Pennsylvania did not provide funds for William W. Strong's book, History of the 121st Regiment Pennsylvania Volunteers, by the Survivors Association, an account from the ranks, there was a program within the state to furnish regimental monuments on battlefields across the country. Thank you for listening to the 27th episode. Links to the books by Corporal Strong, 1st Lieutenant Seville, and 3rd Lieutenant Rogers are now available on the podcast website, firstpersoncivilwarpodcast.com. On Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn this week, you will find pictures of 3rd Lieutenant Rogers and Corporal Strong during the war, and 1st Lieutenant Seville around 1903. Links to all social media accounts are available on the website. And if you do not have any of these accounts, you can find the pictures of these men on the homepage. If you've enjoyed listening to First Person Civil War podcast, please consider supporting it. At the top of each webpage is a link entitled Support Podcast. Payments are sent safe and secure by the Clover Network. Your contributions are greatly appreciated. First Lieutenant James Dinkins of Company C, 18th Mississippi Cavalry Battalion, provides next week's first-person account at the First Battle of Collierville. My name is Bill Coughlin, and thank you for listening to First Person Civil War Podcast.